All right, welcome back. Really excited for this session. Angela presented a while back at a previous PAFOW conference, and I personally wanted to give her more time to share what she had in mind, because she is an innovator. She's someone who has a very virtuous stance on what we're doing. So if without any further ado, Angela, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself and what you're going to be sharing this morning or this afternoon, in your case?
Yeah. Thanks, Al. Morning, everyone. I guess, at least for those who are on the West Coast, and afternoon for those in the UK. My name is Angela Ignam Mathon, and I am the Global Head of People Analytics at Aviva. And today, what I wanted to talk about is the evolution of people analytics as I see it, beyond artificial intelligence and robotics, as a result of sort of the events of 2020 and the things that we've discovered as on the back of the pandemic. For me, this is one of those pressing conversations because it is changing the landscape of sort of the space that we operate in. And so I thought it was good to talk about some of the learnings we've had from 2020 and kind of my predictions for what I think will be the shape of things going forward into 2021 and beyond.
Outstanding. Well, I'll get out of your way and then we'll have a chat in 20 minutes or so. So enjoy.
Excellent. So welcome, everyone. So like I said, I wanted to kind of, talk about some of the kind of, the events of 2020, how that's impacted our space, because I think it's really difficult to be in a people analytics space, to be leading a team and not be sort of conscious of the events of 2020. So what I wanted to start off with is kind of, what we think about people analytics on the maturity curve, right? So many of you will recognize some version of this chart or graph, if you will, because effectively all of us have been sort of asked as to what is the maturity of people analytics? What does that look like over time? What does good look like in this space? And so the graph that we're looking at here is one that is, debated, argued, and discussed on many occasions. I guess, there's as many people that are kind of, for a view like this as they are against it. But it does help to shape a little bit of our thinking as to what we think of people analytics, right? So at a basic level, when we talk about people analytics, we're really talking about the study of human capital with an aim to sort of assess our workforce when it comes to performance, productivity, and profitability, right? So we really want to understand all of the dynamics of the people that are working for us and how they all come together in a meaningful way. And we do that because, there's an economic value that our people bring to the workforce. And, in many cases, there's arguments and debates about how that looks like and how we define that. The human capital has been largely an intangible asset. We know it's valuable. We know it drives productivity. We know there's an economic value to it, but it's been very difficult to sort of name that in a meaningful way. And so some of the ways in which we start to approach that, obviously, is we turn to HR. We look at the HR organization to help us understand and get a sense of what people analytics looks like, what people data looks like, and to help us sort of shape and frame human capital, right? And so when we think about people data, we're the strong driver around that. And so some of the things that, from a maturity perspective, organizations are looking at is just getting a handle on what is people data. And for that, we look at largely transactional HR information. And so what we do with this is we sort of describe basic, right, data sets, right? So, a lot of that's going to be around, onboarding information. So when you are recruiting or bringing people into an organization, you've got some data sitting in some place around that, and how you present and show that. Employees that are in your workforce, and so some demographic data that you might have about your workforce. You might have some information about where they're working. You might have information about the type of activity that they're engaging in. All of this is very much in that descriptive space. And so it's a bit of a noise there. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I'm going to continue on. And so all of that is basically describing types of data that we have in our systems. And a lot of that is sort of kind of like the basic ground level information, if you will, right? So some of that will show up as benchmarks. Some of that will just show up in our basic sort of systems. And a lot of that is just sort of like, where many organizations will find themselves, right? That is just getting your hands around what type of information is available to start with learning. So descriptive analytics is quite important because it helps you describe the landscape as it stands. And every organization will be on a different level on their journey into how they present that. Now, there's usually typically what we call a bit of a wall in terms of how we move beyond descriptive analytics, because that's when we start to look at data and we start to apply some sort of logic, some sort of, analysis, some sort of thinking around how we describe an information. And therefore we start to diagnose problems or issues in the organization when we use that data set. We start to get a bit fancier and start to predict. So how can we start to predict patterns and flows of the workforce and workforce movers? And then in some organizations, we start to get a bit more prescriptive. Now, the prescriptive space is essentially when we start to get into some of the more fancier discussions and conversations, right? Namely, when we start to think about things like machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and robotics, right? Now, typically, that's the conversation that we tend to have, right, as we look at this maturity curve. You know, the holy grail is how we move the organization along and to get into that space. And that is a really tricky thing to do. It requires large amounts of data, clean data in very structured ways in order to get to that space. But typically, when we are talking about people analytics, those are the things that we tend to think about. And it's interesting because when we think of sort of what the drivers are of human capital, they're sort of more simplified things, right? It's about capability, it's about well-being, it's about, you know, learning and values, right? Those are the drivers. And so, you know, when you look at sort of, you know, your maturity when it comes to your people analytics program and kind of where you are, the sophistication of kind of, you know, what your people data looks like and what your program will determine your ability to sort of get to those spaces where you can actually identify what those drivers mean for your organization, right? But this is a classic maturity curve that many of us in this space will be working with. We'll see some version of it. And at any point in time, I can assure you that, you know, several organizations will find themselves along this journey in some capacity. And the question is always around, what's the ROI for that, right? So depending on what that cost looks like to my business, what decisions am I really making based on this investment? So now moving along this maturity curve, right? Like I said, as we get to some of the more sophisticated and fancier spaces, when you start to enter that predictive and that prescriptive space, this is where you find opportunities for automation. Yeah. And this is kind of, you know, this is sort of the holy grail in many ways, because this is when you start to show value, when you're able to identify using evidence and using data in the system, opportunities for improvement. Now, from what I've seen kind of, you know, especially in this past year, a lot of opportunities really center on kind of looking at our operational spaces. You know, so if you think about how many HR organizations are run, there is always going to be this large sort of operational space, right? Which is kind of how you deliver HR through the organization. And that will come from your onboarding processes all the way through to learning and development, all the way through to exiting, right? And that covers a host of activities. And that's kind of the heart of HR, if you will, right? So looking at people data, the goal is to identify ways in which you can use sort of, you know, people data analytics to help you drive your operations in a more seamless fashion. So the conversation is always around how do we improve an existing HR process? And so the spaces in which we typically think about looking at driving analytics is how we sort of improve an HR process, which is again around things like onboarding, right? So if I think about the volume of applicant records that may come in, this information is usually sitting on another platform. And so being able to assess applicant records in a meaningful way presents a really good opportunity, because depending on the kind of organization that you are and the size of applicants that are applying, it does give you a sense of to how strong sort of that program is around how you know, the types of candidates you're attracting in the first place. And so that might be an opportunity for you to assess the quality of the vendors that you may be working with, or third-party providers who are bringing applicants into your organization. And so the opportunity to use more advanced analytics in that space becomes really important, right? Because that's kind of your penetration rate, if you will. Are you getting the right type of quality into the organization? So again, that's a key area in which we think about using more prescriptive analytics. Again, and another space is, you know, candidate selection. So if you think about sort of, you know, areas where an organization may be wanting to use more prescriptive analytics, it will be things like, you know, can you help me identify key candidates for particular roles, right? And so there's a certain amount of data that allows you to do that. But those, again, traditional ways in which we think about using more prescriptive analytics in that space. And the same is true for things like payroll and position management. Again, these are the areas where, you know, if we're being really honest, in terms of maturity around people data and being able to drive prescriptive analytics, all of this tends to center around things like how we improve existing processes. So again, we're talking, you know, payroll processes that can be very manual in some cases. And again, the heart of HR is making sure we pay people on time. So how do we use technology and analytics in an intelligent way to automate those processes where possible? Position management becomes something that's also quite important. So again, many opportunities to leverage artificial intelligence and robotics in those spaces. But again, this view, and many of you guys will have seen some variation of this, is typically where we think about how we can leverage artificial intelligence, robotics, process automation. You know, this is where we tend to think about how we make improvements from a people analytics perspective. And I think it's extremely important that we are obviously always looking at this, because cost challenges and realities are something that many of us are still dealing with and facing. But I think what's interesting about what we've seen last year in 2020 is that the so sort of the global and broader issues that presented themselves, forced HR to kind of look beyond this. So though it was important that HR, was very aware of how they can improve the HR process and the HR offering, what I did find in 2020 is that the conversation did shift, and somehow we found ourselves moving beyond simply improving an HR process, but having to look at people more holistically. And so all the activities that we're looking at here are still very valid and very important. I think the main ones I've called out on the left help you to kind of understand, well, that's typically where many HR analytic programs or people analytic programs have been focusing their attention. But 2020 was unique, right? 2020 brought on a global pandemic that, literally, put a pause into how many people and organizations got work done. We had a racial reckoning, if you will, that took place in the US, but also impacted many people around the world. And geopolitics took on a different stage, right? Suddenly we became aware of just how sensitive we all became. And so the HR universe, as we knew it, went beyond this into something very different. And so when we look at sort of, what the pandemic and sort of the aftermath of that brought on into the discussion, we realized that it wasn't just about improving an HR process, but suddenly we had to look at people in quite broader terms. Some of the things that started to come up was, how we started looking at medical reporting, right? So suddenly we got a lot more personal and needed to understand cases of infection, right? And the infection rate, because suddenly this thing is spreading at a rate that is concerning for many people, right? And so what is the responsibility of the organization is to start tracking it. Some of this was the push from the government, right? Which is we need to make sure that we were lockstep with them. So it was understanding information that we were receiving from the government at the same time that we're trying to process information about our people. So being able to recognize symptoms, right, before they became something more serious, and being able to track movements around that. But effectively what was happening is we found ourselves in a situation where the ask of HR wasn't about improving an HR process, but it was about keeping people safe. It was identifying where are our people located. It was about identifying, do our people have the things that they need, right? So suddenly we're getting involved in business continuity and understanding the use of our facilities. So discussions around how we use those office spaces during that time were very much on the conversation. And it was HR that was being asked to come and to provide that support, right? Being able to understand sort of, things like, how we keep the lights on, right? How do we ensure that our frontline staff is able to continue working? So suddenly you're having to have considerations around, well, broadband and do our people have the right home office setups that traditionally we didn't have to really think about because they were coming into the office and the offices were well equipped, and we were ensuring that, from our real estate perspective, that we were providing people the facilities that they required. But suddenly everyone is now working from home, right? And so that really changed the way in which we had to think about our businesses. And again, it was HR that was kind of being challenged to provide that support, namely analytics teams, right? So what data do we have on hand to talk about those spaces and those locations, and what is the distance from, our people where, and to the office, and what does that look like, and how do we provide the right support if we needed to go out and mobilize in a different way? But suddenly that became a conversation and a data set that we need to explore. Equally, working patterns, right? So, if we look at all of us now, our working patterns have changed drastically because we are no longer working the typical maybe sort of 9-to-5 structure. We have to be a bit more flexible because things like home working have come into the conversation. The way we collaborate now that it's more virtual means that we're on the clock a lot more often, but equally there's supposed to be some flexibility. But in some cases, how does that actually work? If everyone's being flexible, then do we have the right opportunities, and are we in the right space to connect with one another? And so how do we coordinate some of that? The need to sort of connect with people on a more regular basis because we're all virtual. Becomes a big talking point. So really, those collaboration tools and those those regular weekly touch points, daily in some cases, depending on the team. But suddenly, the events of 2020, just from a pandemic perspective, has meant that we've had to take a very different approach to looking at people data. It was no longer just about improving HR processes, as we've seen in the previous slides, and finding ways of improving and ways of sort of automating and getting into sort of artificial intelligence or robotics around a people process or an HR process. Suddenly, we're being asked to look a lot broader when we think about people data and have a much broader conversation. And so my prediction into the future is that we are going to now find ourselves, beyond prescriptive, but we're going to have to get into this holistic state, right? Where we have to start thinking about people in holistic terms and managing our workforce in a very broad sense. And that's, I think, a step change, right? So it's no longer thinking about a classic HR process of onboarding and development all the way to the exit, but we're having to think about people in a much broader terms. And some of that is going to tie into when we think about things like productivity. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things that People Analytics is meant to support is this idea of, how do we assess the productivity of our workforce, right? Because that is a big component of human capital. Well, productivity is no longer how you operate at home, but it's in the office. But a lot of that's going to be around your home office, and what does your home office look like? And that's something that, from a data set perspective, if you were to ask me now, what is the home office situation of my entire workforce? It'd be hard to tell you that. It's not something we even thought about capturing or tracking. But we know it's important because it showed up last year. We had to actually make those considerations. So now, how do we assess productivity from a home office perspective, given that we're pretty confident into the foreseeable future that many of us will be having to work from home or in some sort of hybrid dynamic? We will no longer have the luxury of always working in an office. There will always be this sort of hybrid mix between sort of virtual working and home office. And so therefore, what does that look like? The nature of the work that we're now going to get into. So I think there was a luxury of coming into the office, and there were certain activities that we can naturally engage in because we had the office space to do that, and the luxury of kind of participating in that. Well, if we're in this sort of hybrid dynamic of having to work from home, and then on occasion for those of us, who are in that space coming into an office, the nature of the work that we can deliver starts to change and shape and shift a bit. And so what does that actually look like? And so those are things we have to actually start to consider as the nature of the work in this new environment. Team capacity also becomes something we need to consider, right? And if you're thinking about how you can be productive, well, our concept of teams are going to start to change, right? So teams become a lot more virtual. How do you mobilize a virtual workforce? What does that look like when you're trying to kind of, create meaningful collaboration in that space? And so therefore, that's something we need to consider in a very, very different way. Data as a capability is no longer a nice to have, it becomes a must have. With so many of us working in a different way, working virtually, the way in which we access data changes. So, traditionally you would have been in an office, and some of the information that you learned, right, would have been in terms of, walking past a colleague or, learning something new or finding out about a deadline that you might have missed from an email. And so, the information that you would have had access to that would have had an impact on your productivity when in an office setting suddenly isn't there. And so that requires each individual to get a lot more comfortable with data. So as an organization, if you scale that, how do you think about data as a capability? Right? No longer as a nice to have, or it'd be great if you were. Now it becomes, this is an actual capability that we need to manage. And so therefore, what's the support structures that we are building around that? And what does it mean if our data capability is in the right space? So how effective can you be in your role, right? So again, these are things that suddenly become, no longer nice to haves, but must haves. And we need to track it. And then being able to assess the impact of technology on productivity. So, if a technology or investment in technology isn't where you needed it to be, well, what does that mean when we think of, this new working environment? And so I think, when I look at just productivity on itself, these are things that I think traditionally we've always talked about, or, it was always assumed that, sometime in the future we might get to it. But to me, these are the things that are going to be really, really important in 2021. And again, that's just on productivity, right? So if we think about performance and ways of working, so the home environment now takes on a different measure. So there's one element of talking about, do you have the right equipment at home? But then it's also, what environment are you living in, right? Because, if you've got, caring responsibilities, if the, dynamic of your personal life in terms of, how you're getting on, just where you're living and what that looks like in terms of your spouse or, do you have other family members living with you? But that entire environment suddenly becomes something that we need to be considered of, because that home environment has an impact on your performance and how you're going to start working. And so some of those are things to be considered. Now, again, it's a data set that, as I'm thinking about it, it's just quite personal, but it does have an impact on performance. And so how do we start to think about that more holistically, right? Because our people are whole people. It's not, we're no longer, having the luxury of sort of, turning off at 5 o'clock and walking away. We're in an environment we're always on. And so that home environment suddenly comes into the discussion. Intelligent collaboration becomes something we need to think about. And so, how do we support our workforce to collaborate in the right way? So if someone is available to work, in the morning, and someone's available in the evening, and someone's available at different hours, but you're part of the same team, But what does that look like now, right? So before we were all in the office at the same time, and therefore collaboration looked in a very particular way. Now it's different. Now we're going to have to negotiate handoffs, and now we're going to have to think about how we sort of engage in just a very new and different way. And how do we track that so that we understand that people are moving along in the right direction? So as we set targets around delivery and execution, how our workforce collaborates becomes something we have to consider in our ability to be able to assess whether or not we're moving in the right direction. Our leadership has to kind of operate in a very different way. And so how do we support them, and how do we assess where they are on that journey to be able to know, to understand whether or not we've got the right leaders in the right spaces? Do they have the things that they need? Are they delivering in the behaviors that we're looking for? So that becomes something, again, we need to track, because if it's not happening in the right space, the impact can be immediate. The diversity of our workforce, and again, there's traditional ways in which we think about diversity. I think the events, like we said, of 2020 and around sort of Black Lives Matter and that whole global movement, it was no longer something that we can sort of hide. How do we address that in a meaningful way? But then thinking even more broadly beyond diversity, given that we are now looking at people more holistically, there's elements around how people work. So neurodiversity becomes a discussion that we need to think about. Workforce, sort of home environments are going to become another factor. And so your workforce, when they get home, have very different dynamics happening. So that's going to probably be something on the table to consider. Ways of thinking, the ways of working patterns are going to be something to consider. All of that now becomes game. So when we start to assess performance, we're going to have to take in all of these elements of our people. So again, this holistic approach becomes quite important. And then how we share information, right? Knowledge systems. So when you think of traditional learning programs, how people learn and how people grow, those are going to have to become a lot broader in how we think about sort of, developing our workforce and providing them the right information to make decisions. Again, in an office setting, there's so many different ways in which you can learn about what's happening, what's important. There are filters, right? When we're all isolated at home, and having to work in very different ways, how do we ensure the information is spreading, and how do we ensure that our people are understanding and using the data in a really meaningful way? And so these are some of the topics that I think are going to come to the table. And as we're looking at a lot of this stuff, this is not really about artificial intelligence. It's not really about robotics. This is about looking at people holistically. And so I think from a maturity curve perspective, it's still very much relevant in terms of how we grow and become more sophisticated. But I think it's less around automating, HR processes and systems, and more around really understanding people as holistic beings. And I think that's really quite important, because I think what we've learned in 2020 is that, there's no longer this sort of easy divide between, the office and home. Everything's sort of coming together. And so the fact that everything is merging in a really quick way and a really rapid way means that we have to start thinking about our people on those same terms. And so I think that really changes the conversation of HR and the way HR shows up. And I think the beauty of kind of what we saw last year is that HR has stepped up and has recognized the need to start talking about these things more holistically. And so I think that's, for me, sort of an interesting kind of, trend, because it isn't just about the technology. It's about really recognizing that HR is the function that's about people and about human systems and human structures. And human structures are a lot more complex, and to drive productivity and performance out of human beings requires a very different dialogue. And so I think that's what I'm seeing kind of happening into 2021. And I think we're going to get a lot more sophisticated in how we have conversations around capability and culture, and how we think about transformation, on human terms, not just about systems. So those are my predictions going into the future, and hopefully that was helpful. And it'd be great if we can maybe open up to some questions or to some broader conversations around what's been shared today.
Angela, thank you very much. If you could minimize that screen, and you'll be able to see yourself and unshare your screen as well. And then voila, there you go. Now you can, so that was extraordinary for a variety of reasons. Among the reasons is you are effectively doing that blind. So, and I have some, first off, thank you for putting that virtuous narrative together, because it's not all about, as you said there at the end, we're dealing with people. and there are certain constraints that we're all under. Yesterday, there were several sessions that talked about really understanding the individual needs, not only from an analytics perspective, seeing these broad brushstrokes of types of people, but really understanding the humanity that we're all struggling with, given elder parents, given kids at the house, and so forth. So my first question, and I do have several, and if you, as a listener, a participant, have questions, please put it in the Q&A session or section or the chat. But what you have done when you cite the McKinsey model and BCG model is you're looking at how work gets done in a holistic fashion. So you have robotic automation, you have globalization, you're trying to right size the workforce given certain capacity constraints, all these things. And people analytics historically, frankly, has not been in those discussions. And oftentimes they've been made with a financial orientation or financial first orientation. Now we're in this place, as you noted, where we have, I don't want to call it human centric, but the financial decisions are balanced with the humanity. And not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes business sense, as you alluded to. So my point of question is this: how did this evolve for you at Aviva? Because there's the scenario in my head where your greatness was just shining and you just jumped in and said, okay, this is what we need to do. And so you kind of were an influencer and you brought that to life. The other scenario could be maybe you built a bunch of relationship equity already and people pulled you towards the decision making and providing insight so they could in turn make better decisions. And related to all this, and I know I'm loading you up, is what's the ongoing governance look like, to make this happen? Like, who's your internal customer? How frequently do you meet and all that? So I just wanted to lay that out because I'm really curious on behalf of our broader community, because many are struggling to have impact and really have this more advanced discussion and decision-making process like you've outlined, and others are doing okay. But can you speak to how it evolved for you towards this end?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so people analytics, in HR is one of those areas where, it's depending on where you are in the journey, right? You're either a part of the conversation and therefore you're invited into the room to have those strategic discussions and to influence, or it's very much, the maturity is not there and you're seen very much as a reporting function. So after we've done all the strategic thinking, we're coming to you and saying, can you just get me this data? Right. And the use of sort of an analytics team really depends on kind of the understanding that your CHRO and your HR sort of leadership has about data and its value. Mm-hmm. So I think, specifically for me at Aviva, I had a CHRO who just joined and who was very much passionate about people data and had a leadership team that also understood the value. And so it made it really easy for me when this sort of situation came up to say, hey, here's an opportunity to provide value. Because the minute the pandemic happened, we mobilized. And so it was new for everyone, but it was very much, okay, this thing has happened. We now have to work from home. Okay, quickly, where are we? What are our people? What does it look like? And so my team had been plugged in. We had built some models around, work distance between offices and home environments. So we were able to sort of really get in there quite quickly, plug into our crisis teams and have conversations around how we support people, who has just operationally, right? Who has, the right equipment to work from home. And so we were plugged in from the beginning. And so that made it really easy for us to sort of provide support. And we were able to also say, here's where we've got data available. Here's where we don't have data available. So again, COVID wasn't something we tracked, but quite quickly we knew we had to. And so right away, it was, again, we have a strong partnership with our IT, a strong partnership with our systems. And so right away, we were able to mobilize and to say, okay, we need to track COVID cases. We need to start tracking all this information. So a lot of that is, again, collaboration, that intelligent collaboration that I talked about. We did it naturally. But obviously we'll need to be able to track in a meaningful way. But that relationship was absolutely pivotal. So I think in my case, it was quite easy to do that because, again, there was certain structures that were there that were informally, discussed, but it just, the minute the opportunity came, we mobilized. Now, I think, if you're an organization where those relationships don't exist, it's harder. So I know some analytics teams don't have a good relationship with their IT or their people systems. And so therefore that is concerning and that's difficult, right? Because that means when new data is required, you don't really have the ability or your hands on the right places to influence that. So that's tricky. I think if you don't have a good relationship with your HR leadership, that's also problematic because it means that you're searching in the dark. They have a need for something. You might be able to provide value, but the discussion isn't there. So I have the fortune, again, of working in kind of in a space where those discussions are happening quite regularly, right? We're constantly kind of discussing. And so again, we were just able to mobilize. So the journey for me at Aviva was one where, it could be the nature of the fact that we're insurance and a lot of our values are around caring for people. And so maybe some of that just played into the culture of how we operated. Again, indirectly, some of this stuff is just, it just sort of happened. So I think I got really lucky in that regard. Again, it's an insurance industry, right? So we're always kind of thinking about having everyone back, right? So we have few today for tomorrow. You know what I mean? It's just, we just mobilized. And so I think, a lot of our ability to provide support. And for me to even be aware of sort of these growing needs is just because of how quickly we just all sort of got in line and just started supporting. And it was daily conversations that we were having with one another. And that's how we were able to sort of get to a level of sophistication on some of the stuff I'm describing. But the real shift is, if you look at that first, Ernst & Young view that I was showing you in terms of where we tended to focus our energies prior to the crisis, the discussion on data was how we improved an HR process, because that was our thinking, right? And that's what we're thinking, right? Is how do you improve, our onboarding, our payroll, position management is pretty much around that. And then the pandemic hits and this whole new data set that we really didn't think about too much, suddenly that became the thing to focus on. And so that's how we, and that's why it became important to have those strong relationships with our IT, because those are things we need to start, bringing into our kind of, architecture in our universe to be able to say, how do we have this conversation? How do we support that evidence? And that's really what the big shift was at Aviva, I'd say.
Yeah, congratulations, because in dealing, that's the wrong word, in having the great opportunity and responsibility to interact with many people analytics leaders, there are those who struggle to develop that relationship equity, that frequency of communication, that openness. Because what I'm hearing and what you're saying when you talk about being plugged in is that there is room for exploration. And so let me play this out real quick and get your comments. So many are saying, oh gosh, we're having trouble just getting our head count right, and calculating turnover and providing these basic metrics. And I don't want to go to my internal customers and beyond and have an exploratory conversation with them because they're just going to ask me, oh gosh, you haven't delivered this yet. So is there any coaching, or did you have a similar experience where you said, okay, hey, that metrics and reporting stuff is never going to go away. And in many cases, it's never going to be perfect. But what's going to be most impactful is something that we have to find out, we have to discover, and we in turn have to create what's most important. It sounds like that happened organically for you, or maybe you made a conscious decision at one point and called time out and said, hey, I hear you, but we need to move beyond so we can add more value. Did you get where I'm going? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So at Aviva, so if I think about sort of like the discussion I had before, so prior to this pandemic, the way we thought about operations was very much around, like I said, just how do we improve them? How do we, get costs out of the business and do this more intelligently? And so the data very much speaks for itself when you're looking at it on those terms, right? It's very much, can you show value? So Angela, analytics team, there's so many of you. Can you show us value in that space? And I think there's an element of, there's a bit of a test. I think you have to sort of prove yourself in that area. But I think there's a maturity in terms of the discussion that you have with your leadership. And so I think because I had a leadership that was very much commercial, right? So I think about, my boss is very commercial in how he thinks about things, and he's very much, customer oriented. And so having a discussion with him around our customers and that type of, sort of thinking means that when something like this showed up, it was very easy to mobilize because it was understood that this is very much around how do we manage and support an entire system? And so I think, though there is an element of not everyone's going to be as comfortable with data as a data person or analytics team, but I think there's an element of trust that you establish in some of the work that you've done. So I think there's an element of, my team was able to sort of deliver some areas and kind of develop that credibility, that track record that says, okay, well, when it comes to the classic traditional stuff, tick, they've got that done. But then when it comes to some of the newer areas, let's explore, let's learn together, right? So there's an element of kind of, trust and learn. I think that's kind of what helped us, as we navigated through this, because it isn't that everything is always so straightforward and clear. Sometimes it's a testing and learn culture that you've got established. And so I think we were able to sort of create that, that kind of said, look, let's learn together on this journey. And in some cases, raising their hands and saying, look, we're not sure we understand this. Can you explain? And vice versa, right? But I think having a leadership that's very much plugged into the needs of the business meant that the things that were coming towards me, I was able to sort of realistically say, here's how we provide that support. And so I think, yeah, there's some work on the relationship that you have to develop, but there is an element of, as an analytics team, do you have a sense of kind of, is your finger on the pulse in terms of what's important?
Yep.
Are you comfortable enough delivering that in a consistent way? And once you've established that, then everyone's open to some of the newer and more creative ideas, right? But you've got to earn your stripes a bit.
Yeah. And to your point, the being on the pulse, correct me if I'm wrong, it requires that you're close to your internal customers and understand their needs and what's going to resonate with them and what's going to nudge them. And so you obviously, I keep coming back to this notion of relationship equity. Just for the listeners, those who are participating today, how long have you been in role and there at Aviva?
So I joined in 2018. Okay. And I think, what I quickly did was, like everyone, you have the first 100 days, right? Do you get it? So I took that very much classic approach of just listening, right? And so not just coming in and saying, I'm this fancy data analytics person and I'm going to come in and tell you what you need, but demonstrate that I can listen to what's important. And so coming in, I was able to understand early on that there's some basic things that were really important that needed to get done. And so it wasn't a sexy analytics program that everyone, loves when they first join. It was just the fundamentals and getting some of the basics right. And so I spent the first, I'd say, year and a half focusing on just getting those basics right and creating those partnerships. Sometimes to the extent where, the new shiny object, I had to push that to the side. I had to delay that. And sometimes, internal customers were really frustrated because everyone loves a new thing, a new toy, etc. But it was important we got the wiring right. And so once I've established that, and then you kind of now see the value. At the time you didn't. You're like, well, what are they working on? Why can't I get this funny? I don't understand. But once you get to the point where you establish this is why it was important to spend that time up front and kind of get the basics right. Now they're going, oh, right, okay. Right. So to the point around the headcount, right? It's basic things, but we should have a consistent view of headcount, because when something like COVID shows up, I can't tell people that I don't know how many people are sitting in different offices. That'd be ridiculous, right?
Right.
So we need to have a very clear way of saying, do we know where our people are at any point in time? Not just, the cost, but how far they are from offices. Do they have the right equipment? Those fundamentals, and having established it up front made this conversation and our ability to support our people a lot easier. So I would say, for anyone coming into a new organization, resist the urge to always do the shiny, the fun, the sexy. Get some of those key fundamentals down first, right? Mm-hmm. Once those elements are there, you can always build off of that.
Well, it's great advice. And again, your journey is, I would say, textbook, because there are those who are unable to build the relationships, or to your point, try and do things too fast and kind of miss the mark. So it sounds like you hit the sweet spot. So good for you. Hey, there's a couple of questions that have come in, and I want to frame them in a way that hooks to what we just talked about. So you mentioned earlier, and it's true for everybody, is that there's more remote work, work from home, dynamics that are happening and that will continue to happen. This reality is generating new data, or data that is becoming more catchable. And there's ethics around whether or not we should be catching this data. How much time people are spending on their computers and certain apps and what have you. So putting the ethics aside for a second, how are you getting a gauge on how people are working remotely, whether it be, their activity or how they feel about it? Are you doing surveys? Are you collecting data exhaust? What's happening there for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we're exploring. So I think there is a tactical element of, do we track how people are using, right, these different virtual mediums? And so there's some pilots that we're looking at, exploring as to what that looks like. So, logging in when people are sending emails, meetings. And so there's some traditional things, I think, that we're exploring. But then there's also sort of, the opportunity to listen in a different way. And so there's various collaboration forums that we have that we are basically saying, look, can you tell us how you feel about this, right? And so we're asking the question, We're also driving leaders to have conversations with their people. So rather than trying to formalize it in the sense of, a data set that you're logging into, pushing kind of that behavioral, through the leadership, right? So I can kind of, I can send my team an email link and ask them to fill out a survey, or I can have a direct conversation. In times like this, because of how fast things are moving, it's probably better to have the conversation. So I think there's some, kind of basic things that we are kind of pushing through. But I think from a more formal perspective, we are considering now being able to go to our employees and ask for permission to say, would you be willing to share this with us? And that's something we did last year a lot, which is, because there's so much new information that we're kind of looking at, the first thing was to say, like, are you okay if we start to ask you, or are you comfortable to share? And depending on how the responses are, then we kind of understood, okay, this is something we can leverage. So those are the things that we're exploring. I think, the listening surveys are always important, but they're not always the answer. Sometimes you have to actually engage with your teams directly. So we're exploring quite a few of those options. I think the thing that is, we're cautious about is the perception of Big Brother, right? Yeah. And so you want people to share, but you don't want people to feel as though, we're tracking to the nth degree, and therefore whatever they may have said or done at one point in time is going to somehow limit them or, be a marker on them. So I think we're trying to find that balance of, we want to support you and want to know what your needs are, but equally we don't want to become Big Brother and provide any more additional stress, especially because of the environments that we are. And people are still kind of worried about jobs and job security.
You're right. Yeah, it sounds like you're taking a very thoughtful approach to maintain and potentially even enhance trust in this environment by, asking the question so they feel empowered on how their data is being used or not used. So, good for you. As we start to wrap up, there's a couple questions that one that's from the participants and one that, I'd like to ask. The question from Nikita is that, is there anything that in the data that came to light over the last year or so, given COVID, that surprised you or your internal customers? Like, whoa, this is either a huge opportunity for us to improve, or just I'll just leave it at that. Anything that surprised you or those that you serve?
I think the need to focus on kind of how we work from home, right? So I think, we've always known that home working and virtual working is a thing, but I think there's been a lot of sort of appetite to understand what that means from a productivity perspective. So I think the working patterns, ways of working, we're getting a lot more granular as to kind of what does that mean exactly. And I think, not a total shock, but a surprise in terms of the volume of how that's coming through, because that has implications around culture, that has implications around performance, that has implications around, just what we can expect to get done. So I think, there's a massive focus on, how we think about designing work and how we think about organizing work. That's come through in a really, really strong way. It's no longer one of those things that you can kind of, you sort of can't be sort of fluffy around it. You have to kind of get really granular. So I think for me, that's probably the big one, because it does raise questions around, how we want to collaborate and how we set objectives into the new year. And so I think without clarity on kind of, ways of working and types of work, setting objectives and trying to make, sort of promises, if you will, of what we can deliver is tricky. So yeah, I think that's the one that's kind of come through, is that, the productivity question has always been there. We're at the point now where we need the answer, right? We no longer kind of, survive without knowing how we're going to address that.
Now, does that, for you, that at Aviva, tail into, or is it integrated with employee experience design or anything? Is there something behind it, an initiative that's trying to design work differently? And it sounds like, if so, you're a part of that. You're bringing the...
Absolutely. I mean, employee experience is definitely going to be a part of that. And I think we're trying to sort of find the sweet spot between, employee experience just as, what it feels like to work at the organization, but also from a performance perspective, which is, how does it, how do you get work done, right? And so I think there's a nice balance between the two, and trying to find ways in which to bring those data sets together to kind of get a sense of that. So I think, there's actually a combination of that. I think where it's tricky is the employee experience is no longer in the office.
Right.
How the employee experience is really happening in the home as well. And so how do we factor that into the discussion? I think that's what makes it really tricky. Employee experience before was very much, like I said, it was an HR process you're managing, and therefore I can make you feel a particular way because, bring you in, there's an onboarding and all the rest of it. But now you're having to experience the organization virtually in your home. And so that factor into it. So again, it's just interesting times that we're in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm so glad, we did this. And I'm recalling our previous conversation, your previous session, and it's, you have a lot of depth to the work that you are doing and have done. And, so thank you for sharing today. And that leads into my final question for you is, how do you learn? What is your background? How did you get to this point where you're able to do what you do? And I'll say this before I let you answer, is that there's a gross undersupply of people analytics leaders and people analytics professionals in general. And so to ramp up quickly a lot of people to do what you're doing is a challenge. And it's something that I'm trying to solve in my little way. But what's your journey been like? And related, what would be your advice or suggestions to those who want to get better at this?
Yeah, thank you. And also, that's a great question, actually, because I try to figure out myself as to why do I enjoy this job so much? At my heart, if I'm being honest, I'm kind of like your classic business school, MBA, commercial. So there's a big part of my thinking that is very much commercially oriented, which is, why are we doing this? Why does it matter? What's the benefit? And so I think there's an element of my personality that's always thinking very business, very commercial, right? So that's kind of, the heart of kind of how I frame things. But I think separate to that is that I'm very fascinated by people. I find human beings quite fascinating, and the way we behave and the way we work together. And I've always found that to be the case, right? And so I think, the things that I read and the things I study is just psychology and human dynamics and how we get work done and how office culture is so different from our home lives. And so I just find I'm constantly trying to ask questions to understand, ways of working behavior. I'm fascinated by culture. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm American. When I'm in the UK, I love this tension. I love this sort of, different ways of thinking. When I was working in France, I'm also of Creole descent. I thought it was fascinating because the French office is a very different from a British one and from the American one. I love stuff like that. Some people find that really difficult and challenging. But I find it fascinating because, again, we're all talking about ways of working, but they transpire so differently into these markets. So I think a good people analytics leader is someone who really understands the actual data they're looking at and what it actually says, and they're curious and they're challenging. And I think that's kind of the thing that I've got, which is I'm always challenging, I'm always asking questions. I don't assume I know everything. I listen to my leaders. So when the HR leaders are asking me questions and telling me that, hey, I really need this, I don't make the assumption of, well, why? That's dumb. You should be looking at this. I actually listen to understand. So I think there's a natural curiosity and a fascination for people wrapped around this kind of commercial, I guess training or education, if you will. And yeah, I think if you have those components, then I think you have the makings of a really good people analytics.
Well, I couldn't have said it better, and I 100% agree. I mean, we need in our profession, what you just said is an insatiable curiosity and willingness to learn. And that means that we have to do affirmative inquiry. That means that we have to be open to other ideas that aren't in our sphere of knowledge. And so, kudos to you for being creative. By the way, how long have you been over there? I'm not going to ask why I'm saying that, or why I'm asking that. But how long has it been?
I've been in the UK for 6 years now. Yeah.
I will say this. Okay, since I just got busted, your pronunciation of the word data. I don't want to make you self-conscious. That's why I was trying to withhold, but let's just put it this way. It's very proper. It's a compliment. It's a compliment. So anyway, thank you again for doing what you do. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, hope to see you in person at some point here in the near future. But yeah, keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.